Hello guys, welcome to another video, and in this one I want to do some discussion on a brand new aspect skill that was added to the game in the Allflame League, and there was actually 4 new aspect skills. I'm going to be doing some videos on some of the others as well because they're really quite good, but the one that I want to focus on this video here is Aspect of Solaris. So you can see I have that on this item right here. This is actually a suffix modifier, and first of all I'll just go through how exactly you get this onto one of your items. So to do that, you're going to have to use one of these Brinehook Ducats, and this says that it crafts a random Pantheon aspect skill onto an item. Now you can place the Brinehook Ducat in here into the crafting window and along with your item, and you can actually craft this on here. It's not too expensive. This is an item level 74 item. I think this goes up to about 10,000 Dead Man Sulfur or something like that, an item level 85. And it's not that bad, but do note that this one here, it says it crafts a random Pantheon aspect skill onto your item. Now that is a suffix modifier, so you need to have an open suffix. But what this is going to do is it's going to create 4 options for you to choose from. But even though there are 4 aspect skills, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be offered all 4 aspect skills, because each option here gets rolled randomly between the 4. So because there's 4 options and there's 4 things to choose from, that means that you have a fairly good chance of actually getting offered the aspect that you want to choose, but note that you may have a scenario there where you don't get offered the one that you want. Obviously, I've already crafted this on here, so I can actually show you exactly what this skill does, but that is how you get that. This Ducat is not very rare. If you're playing SSF, you can look for a chart area there. I believe it's called Brine King's Domain, and in there, all of the rare monsters are Brine King touched. And they either always drop one of these, or they have a very high chance of dropping one of these. I think I dropped about 6 of them when I was in one Brine King's Domain, so they're pretty common from that particular area. And another way to actually get these is with the Changeling's Ducat. This transforms into a random Ducat when you actually place it in here, so I can show you that right here. You craft one, and then you can actually just look between the 4 that you get offered here, and for example, there is 2 of those ones, so they are very, very common, and you can actually just grab one of those. So here is the skill, Aspect of Solaris. Note that this has a base reservation of 25% of your mana, and this is showing 19% there because of my mana reservation efficiency. And also, the debuff base duration is 4 seconds per stack, and this is being scaled up by my own skill effect duration modifiers, which we'll talk about that in a little bit. But this skill says, while active, inflicts fire exposure on enemies within its radius. Additionally, periodically applies a Sun Scald debuff to enemies within its radius, with each Sun Scald debuff increasing the effect of exposure on affected enemies. Sun Scald can stack up to 5 times. So each stack usually lasts 4 seconds, so you will want a little bit of skill effect duration to actually improve this up to over 5 seconds, so that when you're constantly in range of a target, they are going to be able to build up those full 5 stacks. And it says, Sun Scald causes 15% increased effect of exposure on affected enemies, and obviously the debuff is inflicted there once per second. And important to note there is that modifier, the Sun Scald debuff there, it's 15% increased effect of exposure on affected enemies. It does not specify fire exposure, and I've actually done some testing with this to confirm that, yes, it does appear to work on other exposure as well. And I did the test with, cold damage and things like that, so it seems to work on cold exposure, and that's exactly what it says on this skill. Even though it is an aspect of Solaris, which is, fire-themed, and it inflicts fire exposure in this kind of radius aura-like effect, the debuff there does scale all types of exposure. It does have a radius of 4 meters, so it's quite big. And I can actually try and show you that right here. So let me just turn this off so I have mana. And we'll activate that. And you'll actually be able to see this kicking in on targets when they're actually just close enough. So if we move here, we can actually see the fire exposure there. Do you see that? Do you see this glow appearing on this enemy as we just get into range? There it is there. So it is a fairly big radius, and obviously if you're bossing or something like that, which is where this is going to really matter because you need to wait a decent duration there to actually get the full effect, it is not too far away. But I guess more importantly than that is where this is going to be effective. And this patch we have 2 pretty strong standout builds in Winter Orb and Cold Dot, and both of those builds can make use of this. But what exactly is this doing? So at maximum stacks, with 5 stacks on the enemy, you're going to have 75% increased effect of exposure. Now, that is a lot of increased effect, considering how much exposure you can actually get. So first of all, a few notes on exposure. When you have something in the game which says that it inflicts exposure, but it doesn't actually tell you how much exposure it is, for example, this Eye of Malice helmet here says 25% chance to inflict cold exposure on hit. If it doesn't tell you how much it is, that's going to be a base 10% exposure, so that will lower the monster cold resistance by minus 10%. And if you look here, you can get a modifier. There's a couple of different modifiers that actually affect exposure. One is this type here, which says exposure you inflict applies at least minus 18% to the effective resistance. Now, this elemental mastery here will only do something if your total exposure is lower than 18%. So, for example, if you're using this along with something that also adds extra exposure, like this Tollborn here, which says cold exposure you inflict applies an extra minus 12% to cold resistance, then if you add that base 10% exposure plus the 12%, you'd already be at 22%. At which point this mastery wouldn't do anything. It doesn't add to the 10% and then you get this added on top, it just checks the total exposure. So that one isn't very useful in this particular case. However, if we look, there are some other modifiers. For example, the Fire Mastery there has fire exposure you inflict applies an extra minus 5% to fire resistance, and this is an additive one, so this is the same wording as the one on Toolborn there, where it's just taking your base exposure and adding an extra amount on top to increase it to a higher total. And one of the really notable mentions there, of course, is the Elementalist, with the Mastermind of Discord node, which says exposure you inflict applies an extra minus 25% to the effective resistance. That is really quite powerful. Note that there is also a version over here on the Scion Ascendant on the Elementalist, which is a slightly weaker version at minus 20%, but that's still very, very good. Something else to mention there is that there are other ways to actually lower resistance, for example, the Combustion Support Gem, or there is this node over here called Snowforged, which says enemies ignited or chilled by you have minus 5% to elemental resistances. These are other ways to actually lower monster resistances, but they're not inclusive of exposure, so they will not be scaled by that exposure effect coming from aspects of Solaris. Now, if we compile all of that together, you can get a ridiculous amount of resistance stripping from this skill here combined with exposure stacking. It's going to be most effective on an Elementalist, but you could also do this on a Scion. So let's take the example of you have a base 10% exposure, right? Let's say you're using Eye of Malice, or maybe you have another way to apply a base 10% exposure for cold resistance, and that applies a base minus 10% to cold resistance to the monster. And then you're playing an Elementalist with the Mastermind of Discord node, so that minus 10% is now minus 35%, and you're also using Toolborn, or maybe using the Foulborn version for the extra gem levels there. That's another minus 12%, so you now have a total of minus 47% cold resistance. Now, if that monster had the 5 stacks of Sunscald on them, that debuff that increases exposure by 75% in total, that 47% exposure to cold would actually be minus 82% cold resistance, which is absolutely insane. And even crazier than that is the fact that that's just a base 10% exposure. You could use something like Frost Bomb, which has a base cold exposure of 15%, at which point, when we add all that together and multiply it by the exposure effect, that would be 91% cold exposure coming from that combination. But we also have Fire Dot, lots of people are playing RF, lots of people are playing things like Scorching Ray of Immolation. So I should also mention that there is a very good setup that you can use for fire resistance that can get even better than that, because there's the existence of Pyroclast Mine of Sabotage, which applies a base minus 25% to fire resistance. So if you have that, along with the Elementalist exposure there from Mastermind of Discord, that would be 50%. And as I mentioned before, you can get the Fire Mastery there for another 5% for a total of 55% exposure, which when multiplied by the 75% exposure would be a total of minus 96% to fire resistance for that monster. Now here's the thing, that is just exposure. That's not inclusive of things like curses. For example, if you're doing fire, you can use flammability along with elemental weakness if you have an extra curse. If you're doing cold, you can do frostbite along with elemental weakness, and that will provide another around 70% or so depending on your curse effect. And then you even have extra things to lower resistance. We mentioned one of them there before in the Snowforge node there for another minus 5%, or you could use combustion, for example, or even both for a lot of extra minus resistance scaling. So if we take one of those examples there, the cold or fire resistance, along with the minus resistances coming in on top with the curses as well, you would end up with somewhere around minus 150 to minus 160% cold or fire resistance, and that is going to bring a pinnacle boss from 50% resistance down to around minus 110% or so, which is already incredible. At that point, you're just doing so much more damage. But then you have Eye of Malice, which is a unique helmet that says nearby enemies have 50% increased fire and cold resistance. Now, this modifier actually scales negative resistances as well. So with minus 110% resistance to either fire or cold, that would be improved to minus 165% resistance in total, which is just absolutely ridiculous. That is so much extra damage being taken from that monster. So this really is putting in some work here, the aspect of Solaris, because quite a large chunk of that minus resistance is coming from the extra that's coming on here, along with the multiplier from Eye of Malice. So that is really quite strong. And keep in mind that the negative resistance cap is minus 200%, so you are getting fairly close there with that combination, and I think at a push you could actually reach that if you were to include all of the other things like, you know, combustion support, snowforged, maybe a bit of extra curse effects there for your curses, and you'd probably be able to get up to minus 200%, which is absolutely crazy. That is really, really strong. So overall, that is a crazy, crazy combination to be able to get really high amounts of negative resistances on monsters. So aspects of Solaris, I think, really quite good as a 25% reservation. And I will be doing some other videos on the other Pantheon aspects there, because they're quite good as well. But that's going to be it for this video. I just wanted to discuss this aspect because I think it's really quite good. Thanks for watching this video, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.